Recently, I've been thinking a lot about Minecraft. A lot of people are right now with the film and the game's recent 15-year anniversary, but my mind has been on something a tad more niche. A conversation that has been permeating a certain corner of Minecraft's community. This discourse around Minecraft's remarkable ability to induce unease and anxiety in the player. How Minecraft could be viewed as a horror game.
It's easy to write some of these discussions off as just another example of internet kiddies turning innocuous media creepy in order to scare themselves.
The Backyardigans is actually pretty fucked up if you think about it.
Personally though, I think there's an argument to be made that throughout Minecraft's history, it has intentionally implemented various elements of horror in its gameplay mechanics, atmosphere, and aesthetics, especially in the earlier versions. Beneath the surface, there's more to the game than just playing with virtual blocks. And I mean, so many people seem to share these same experiences, the same feelings. It's worth a closer look.
For this special Halloween video, I want to take a plunge into the world of horror in Minecraft. First, exploring the origins of Minecraft's most iconic horror elements like the cave sounds in Herobrine to get an understanding of Minecraft's history with horror. I want to take an in-depth look at Minecraft's more recent community-made horror projects to get a sense of what specifically about Minecraft seems to scare them, and then finally compare Minecraft's design and mechanics to games in the horror genre, from classics like Resident Evil and Silent Hill to more contemporary entries like The Forest. All of this in an attempt to see how much water these discussions around Minecraft as horror hold, and see if there's enough evidence to convincingly make the argument that Minecraft is kind of a horror game. Happy Halloween.
I'm no stranger to Minecraft horror media. I've covered a couple spooky Minecraft web series here on the channel, and watched a dozen or more in my own time, but I don't think I've ever given the game itself, on its own, a deeper look, at least not in a video. But this horror corner of the Minecraft community just keeps growing bigger and bigger, and it seems that they're not just using the game as a platform to tell a horror story, but that there's something specifically about Minecraft that's unsettling in its own right, that is inspiring these projects. Dozens of Reddit posts and YouTube videos about players feeling a sense of unease in their beta or alpha worlds, and popular mods like Minecraft PSX completely transforming the game into the haunted image of a classic PlayStation horror game.
I'll be taking a look at all of this, but I think it makes the most sense to take a look back first to get an understanding of how we got here.
I first played Minecraft in its classic era, the browser version, which would place it sometime around 2009 to 2010. At that point in its development, the game functionally operated as and closely resembled a virtual Lego baseplate. Though there's a little more depth to the landscape with small caves, hills, and trees, the breadth of the game doesn't extend much past what you can build with the modest block options in your hotbar and build menu. The visuals and mechanics, from the lighting to the textures, feel playful, even childlike. But this simplicity, the lack of direction and superfluous mechanics, don't at all make the game feel limited or constrained. Quite the opposite. It's uninhibited. It unlocks a sense of boundless creativity which rivals that of Lego. And of course, that seems to have been and continues to be one of the appeals of the game.
But as Minecraft continued its development from in-dev to inf-dev, from alpha to beta, the project's identity continued to evolve, and a different kind of atmosphere began to form as the game's horizons started to expand.
As the infinite terrain generation was implemented, the game world shifted from feeling quaint and miniature to vast and at times imposing. More miles of rolling, pixelated hills than one could ever hope to fully explore, caves deeper and darker than ever before. With the introduction of a looming night cycle where deadly monsters would begin far outnumbering the player, as well as resource management mechanics, the game became explicitly about one thing first first and foremost, something that had to be taken care of before the player could begin using it as a creative outlet. Survival.
And suddenly, the game isn't just about leisurely snapping blocks together. Though some of these changes seem only incidental in their horror effects, others seem rather explicit.
Alpha 1.0.3 adds the now iconic cave sounds, eerie ambience playing when in or near caves which act almost as a jump scare, causing even veteran players' hair to stand on end, and are very clearly meant to spook the player in their most vulnerable state. By Beta 1.8, Endermen are added, a direct reference to the Slender Man character who was reaching a peak of popularity at that point, with some of the most horrific sound effects in the game.
As the game developed, both intentionally and unintentionally, it seemed to continue cementing elements of horror into the game. Now, keep in mind, this is only one facet of the game. It's not like it was exclusively some kind of scare fest. But this is the facet of the game we're going to be focusing on.
So now, your low render distance isn't just a graphical limitation, it's an encroaching fog obscuring ever-present threats. Going caving, essential for gathering resources, now becomes a bit more uneasy in experience, with the ever-present darkness, hostile mobs, and the aforementioned hair-raising cave ambience, which seems to imply something ominous and unseen is approaching.
Again, this isn't to say that the elements of childlike imagination or creativity were gone. On the contrary, the massively expanded size gave the world a feeling of even more endless possibility, and exploring it felt like a genuine adventure. And as the game finally released and continued to evolve up to now, many will tell you that some of that uneasiness is gone, relegated to something oddly specific about this pre-release era.
But looking at the game through this lens, is it any wonder that many players felt not entirely at ease, not entirely alone, that there might be someone or something hiding in the fog?
Now, of course, this all seems a little dramatic for a funny block game, but you'll have to remember that many players at this time were fairly young, myself included, with very little knowledge about the game. Documentation about how Minecraft worked was not as easy to access as it is now, leaving many to rely on forum posts and schoolyard rumors. For many, their introduction to the game was essentially punch trees to get wood, make a house fast because monsters come at night. I would also argue that a game's graphical fidelity isn't necessarily a hard line in its ability to create an unsettling atmosphere. Playing these early versions even now can feel a bit disquieting, especially when you run across a particularly strange anomaly or get stuck out at night with no shelter. And as I mentioned, these early versions seem to be the ones that players continue to feel the most unsettled by.
I find old versions of Minecraft really creepy and unnerving. Does anyone else find the old beta versions creepy? The Minecraft alphas and betas are their own genre of horror, and everyone seems to have their own reasons and theories as to why it feels this way. It's the expansive, possibly endless and meaningless world. It's almost Lovecraftian. It always felt like something was lurking in that fog. Something just out of sight that you can't see, but it can see you. I think it has to do with the fact that the world is so barren, but yet the alpha color scheme is so vibrant. It's almost like a nuclear super bloom, and you can't help but feel alone, like the sole survivor.
It's the Herobrine place!
I'm not sure there's one universal answer as to why these early versions specifically were so creepy to so many players, but I do have some ideas. First and foremost, the game simply had less features and variety.
Looking at the game now, there's so much going on in every area, so much more detail, so many more mobs, a variety of landscapes and environments. The pre-release versions, by comparison, feel so much more empty, isolated. In addition, the new versions of the game have updated the fog in a way that seems to have minimized the eeriness it used to hold. The fog in these old versions just feels so thick and murky, more physically there, and the nights back then were so much darker. With no brightness slider option, torches really were your only respite from the all-encompassing inky blackness. And then there's the little things. Skeleton bow shots were really fucking loud and startling in some of these early versions. Creepers blended in more with that lighter grass texture. There's different things to like about the newer versions and the older versions, but I think it seems pretty clear that the older versions have an edge on the creep factor.
It seems inevitable that an environment like this would begin to spawn rumors and creepypastas surrounding the game, the most popular of which was, of course, Herobrine. I'm sure most of you know about the original screenshot and story associated with it.
Another player somehow appearing in people's single-player worlds, looking just like the default character model but with blank white eyes, stalking the player through their world, leaving traces of its presence in the form of small pyramids, tunnels dug into caves and mines, and trees missing their leaves. And then, of course, the over-the-top but iconic backstory of the entity, the ghost of Notch's dead brother, who didn't actually really exist.
I'm willing to bet most people who grew up playing Minecraft have some kind of Herobrine related story. I had plenty of them. I created a whole plan for a server with my friends specifically for hunting Herobrine, with a watchtower design and exactly how we would do the searching. One day on the playground, I had a friend tell me that Herobrine was definitely in our server because some mysterious entity pushed them into lava, and yet none of their items burned, instead floating just next to the lava pit. Another time, a group of us discovered that classic glowstone E had appeared mysteriously in a cave on our server one day, and we were convinced it was proof of Herobrine, until one of our other friends was like, oh yeah, I built that. The Herobrine concept was very appealing to players at the time, although also a clear frustration to many in the Minecraft forums who had to keep explaining to scared 8-year-olds that he wasn't real. But it was very specifically appealing to me. As a kid, I was obsessed with cryptids and ghosts. I watched tons of Finding Bigfoot and Ghost Hunters. I even made a Bigfoot hunting documentary of my own.
I mean, I'm not a full-grown person, but it's pretty big.
Herobrine was almost like a digital cryptid. No longer did I have to convince my parents to take me out to the woods at 5 a.m. while we were on vacation so I could do Bigfoot calls. I could run around the woods looking for evidence from the comfort of my own home, scaring myself over nothing, just like my favorite shows.
Although Herobrine does seem to be the face of Minecraft horror, and has been for years, it didn't start that way. Many of you probably know about his progenitor, the White Eyes creepypasta.
But if you trace the origins of the character back far enough, you can find a specific update which added another of these intentional horror elements. The character didn't just spawn from a community hoax or spooky story out of nowhere. The source point of Herobrine came from within the game itself, something seemingly innocuous. A single .ogg file.
On July 30th of 2010, Mojang released its 7th Secret Friday update to Minecraft Alpha. With it came the addition of the jukebox and the first music discs, composed by C418, Cat, and the mysterious Disc 13, aka 13.ogg. Instead of a peaceful electronic backtrack of piano, handpan, and synth, it's a far more off-putting piece. An ensemble of atmospheric bells and ominous tones, accented with the sounds of hostile mobs, the twang of a skeleton's bow, the hiss and blast of a creeper. The ambience suggests the environment of a cave, and the scattered sound effects tell some kind of vague story, a player on the run in a cave infested with monsters. This disc has since become the center of many Minecraft theories and rumors, but is more than likely just a spooky auditory interpretation of the experience of being lost in a cave within the game, condensing the highs and lows into an unsettling soundscape. Still, C418's ability to beautifully evoke emotions with his music was no different when applied to fear, and understandably, it immediately caught the attention of players as odd. Another of these departures Minecraft takes into the sphere of horror. On the same day, YouTube user Kerchak uploaded the audio along with an image, the dark tunnels of a cave, otherwise empty except for 2 white pixels in the bottom left corner.
Minecraft's community is one of the more thorough and passionate on the internet, and so the journey from here is actually pretty well documented on the wikis, which I've included in the sources document, but here's the basic rundown.
On July 31st, user IamHedgehog posts a series of stories on the Minecraft forum, narrative interpretations of the various songs from the game, including Disc 13. He turned around in surprise just as an arrow pierced his hand and sent him tumbling towards the wall. He flopped over top the chest and bashed his head on it, sending the mining helmet rolling off and into the corner, shining the light on the approaching creatures. In a reply to this thread, user Flaky posts a story supposedly copied from 4chan, a story about a haunted cave system where torches go missing and passageways suddenly appear. Eventually, the player finds Disc 13 in a chest, which is seemingly the source of these hauntings. But the aspect of real interest is their use of Kerchak's video. Not only do they link directly to it for use as reference to the audio, they also seem to incorporate those 2 white dots as a part of their story. I couldn't resist just having a peek down into the mine. I slowly poked my head down. It was dark. Nothing could be seen, except for 2 white dots next to each other like eyes. Something was down there, looking into my eyes. I felt like I was looking at death itself. And later, I hear a ghoulish laugh behind me in the pitch black, and 2 white eyes were there. Looking at me, I freeze. I can't move. I'm locked into a staring contest with the eyes. I hear whispers from all around me telling me to go closer. I can't. I must resist.
This detail of 2 white eyes following the player was further utilized in the version of the White Eyes story that seems to be the most popular.
On August 1st, user Endorphine creates a short post on the Minecraft forum titled, "I cannot take it anymore." This thread also links to the 13.org video. I can't take it anymore. I can't go back home. I can't go into my mines. I can't do anything anymore but slowly try and build something under the frozen ocean. It's all because of 2 little pixels.
2 pixels! 2 white pixels! I haven't even seen them myself except in screenshots!
When user Blaster explains this is likely caused by rendering issues, Endorphine responds, "No, you're wrong. It's White Eyes, as we named her."
The story of this White Eyes entity began to circulate around the Minecraft community, eventually morphing into the character of Herobrine. It's not exactly clear when this name and story first appeared, but it would have been fairly soon after, as we can find this archived tweet from August 19th, 2010.
At Notch, "Hey, someone made a story about your brother Herobrine. You remember him, right? You should totally add him to Minecraft."
So by this time, the name and origin as Notch's brother would have been introduced.
Later posts in August archived by the Minecraft community show some other interesting early iterations, such as Goaty's Horror in Minecraft, which shows screenshots of some strange happenings in a Minecraft world and reference a character with the default Steve skin except with white eyes. By August 31st, the story in its most popular form was posted to 4chan via this image, which contains the story and screenshot most of us are familiar with by now. The strange figure in the fog, the pyramids and tunnels showing up in single-player worlds. Interestingly, I found a lot of posts referring to Herobrine simply as him, capital H, which seems to have fallen out of fashion for the most part when discussing Herobrine nowadays.
I think in many ways, the Herobrine story was kind of ingenious. Of course, many of these early stories engage in some pretty tired and even unintentionally comedic creepypasta tropes, and many of them are poorly written in retrospect. But the concept at the core of them is actually really interesting, in the way they use elements of the game in their stories. We don't just see an evil bloody monster appear in the game or gore images in the files, it's more subtle. Torches disappearing from caves, world generation that looks just a little too intentional. A lot of the same stuff that modern Minecraft horror does well, in my opinion, using the language of the game itself to tell the story.
I discussed this in my first digital horror video with old Minecraft re-uploads. The way people playing the game tend to dig out tunnels or build things versus how they appear in natural generation, for someone who's played the game long enough, becomes immediately obvious. And then the implications of an unnatural formation come with an immediate sense of dread, an understanding that you may not be alone in a world where you should be. The somewhat more subtle and clever approach to the story, I think, is what made Herobrine catch hold of the community in the way that he did. And keeping things as simple as strange terrain generation and 2 pixels helped to place that paranoia into your own game. It sounds in some ways believable, and it's far more possible to find a cave that looks a little odd or see 2 out-of-place pixels in your own world than it would be to see a hyper-realistic jump scare face in your game. And in this way, the feeling that something in your game might be Herobrine's doing further induced unease in many while playing the game. The fog may be hiding something more than skeletons and creepers. Of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Brocraft stream. Largely credited with popularizing Herobrine to the level it is today, Minecraft streamer Copeland from Brocraft came across this Herobrine story at some point and constructed an elaborate hoax, culminating in a stream where he would encounter Herobrine, flee, and end the stream, eventually pointing his viewers to a website containing an image of Steve's face with hyper-realistic eyes, as per creepypasta tradition, and a scrambled message taken from another creepypasta, Wake Up, which implies the reader is actually stuck in some kind of torture-induced fantasy world which they must wake up from. Despite this event's popularity and influence, the stream and all known archives of it would eventually be lost. Blame It on Jorge has a great video detailing all of this, and thanks to the added exposure from his video, someone who had downloaded the stream back in the day ended up finding it and uploading it. So that's cool.
Despite Herobrine's place as one of the most recognizable faces in creepypasta, and even Minecraft's official recognition of him with their recurring removed Herobrine patch notes, the character hasn't really been considered scary for many years now. Though to be honest, that's true of most iconic creepypasta characters, so maybe it's not in spite of that position. Either way, the reputation of the character at this point is mostly that of something exclusively little kids were scared by, and even they haven't taken the character seriously in years. He mostly appears in memes and nostalgic discussions of the stupid stuff we used to believe in as children. And again, to be fair, it seems pretty apparent that even at the peak of the character's popularity, it was still mostly relegated to small children spamming Minecraft boards with their fears of Herobrine, and then exasperated tweens having to explain over and over that he isn't real. All of this is to say, the apparent face of horror in Minecraft lost its fear factor. So in place of Herobrine, what has this recent horror niche been doing instead? So, what have these more recent horror creators been doing differently now? Honestly, not much, aside from doing it better, in my opinion. Though more formally organized into the genre of unfiction now, in a way they're following in the traditions of the earliest hoax videos and scary stories. Like I mentioned earlier, the genius behind Herobrine is its exploitation of the unease so many players seem to have about feeling not alone in the game, and using the language of the game to imply something is in the world with you. And these newer Minecraft series like Old Minecraft Reuploads or Andrew Gaming do the exact same thing. On that front, they've basically just removed Herobrine's face.
Old Minecraft Reuploads is to me the most obvious example of this, and is maybe one of the best out there in the genre, with some of my favorite moments. The silhouette of a player in the cave, the sudden noises of blocks being placed, and the ground covered in mob drops, implying some sort of mass death. And Andrew Gaming has taken that initial concept of being stalked in the game and ran with it, developing it into a much more expansive and original story.
But the core of these projects are very much the same as the earlier stories. This connection even follows through to some of the more obscure spooky concepts in Minecraft's history.
Back in the day, there was a brief trend of UFO sighting hoaxes in the game, the idea for which was more recently revamped into one of the most unique Minecraft web series I've ever seen, the now non-canon Close Encounters of the Crafting Kind from Minespiracy, which wonderfully incorporates things like Minecraft's brick pyramid and concepts of Stonehenge and the 2001 obelisk into a really fun UFO alien investigation within the game.
I'd love to cover this series in more detail, actually, but I'm interested to see what Minespiracy does now that this series has been made non-canon. All of this is to say that the kinds of things these newer creators are finding scary within Minecraft are very much the same things we did back when the game was first coming out, which to me speaks to the idea that these horror elements are more inherent to the game itself and not just a fluke of the community. And the community isn't just exploring this horror through web series either. Recently, there's been a pretty sizable trend of modders creating new hostile mobs specifically meant to turn at least part of the game into an explicit horror experience.
As far as I'm able to tell, this started with modder and YouTuber Gargan's mod and video, The Cave Dweller. In this video, he discusses how the project was directly inspired by the ominous presence implied by the cave sounds, the design of the Enderman in the game, and the fear of being stalked a la Herobrine. The YouTube scene for this niche almost feels like a battleground. Modders creating videos explaining their process and the specific pieces of Minecraft's horror they try to heighten or implement in their creatures and design choices, other modders trying their hand at improving the concept with their own take on it, and YouTubers analyzing the whole trend and explaining why none of them are getting it right. It's quite a lively conversation.
One of the most successful of these projects is actually a mod pack. a transformation of the game into a genuinely unsettling horror experience, emphasizing all the pieces of horror which players seem to experience from the game, complete with its very own creepypasta world building. I'm talking, of course, about Minecraft PSX Edition. This mod pack has been the topic of a dozen or more videos at this point, so I don't want to overdo my coverage here, but I think the mod pack strikes an interesting chord. The early PlayStation aesthetic to me seems like the perfect expression of Minecraft's horror side. For one, much of Minecraft's recent horror resurgence has come with an element of nostalgia. The use of early versions of the game and of early YouTube video aesthetics are fairly commonplace. I've discussed in the past how this nostalgia can be used to contextualize what we're seeing, to place ourselves in the mindsets we had as children, more ready to believe that something unexplainable might be happening in our game, more easily scared by seeing something we don't understand, and less skeptical to something of the paranormal. Meanwhile, the early PlayStation aesthetic has experienced a similar revival, to a similar effect, but I think it goes a little deeper than just nostalgia for Minecraft and the PlayStation. The retro aesthetics of both serve the medium of horror particularly well. Minecraft and early PlayStation games actually share a surprising amount of similarity visually, with their low-res pixelated textures and low-poly 3D graphics. The simplicity and lo-fi visuals turn everything you see into a vague and hazy impression of itself, and the ambiguity of this art style functions to abstract the visuals and events into more amorphous and nebulous concepts, putting the onus on the player to interpret and fill in the blanks. What the dangers truly look like becomes more vague and conceptual, letting our imagination do some of the heavy lifting. Whether it's Minecraft or Silent Hill or other retro horror experiences which use the limited graphics and textures, the effect is an unsettling, murky quality to the imagery of the game. You could make a similar comparison, and many have, to the fog present in Minecraft and in Silent Hill, as graphical limitations further add an element of the unknown and danger. Like we've been saying, something hiding in the fog. To continue that point, I think the best way to experience this mod pack for yourself is to embrace the entirety of this retro visual style and the visual fuzz and haze that comes with a good CRT TV. Hook it up to your PC, grab a controller, and see what spooky experiences await you. It's an average Saturday afternoon. You decide to hit up some local garage sales to see if you can get a good deal on any retro games. These relics, forgotten by time, remind you of a simpler world. Something out of the corner of your eye catches your attention. A lone PlayStation 1 game. Minecraft, PlayStation Edition. How can this be? You think to yourself. Minecraft wasn't created until 2009. By then, even the PlayStation 3 was already 3 years old. This is impossible. In what is not your proudest moment, you close the case, shove it into the pocket of your hoodie, and as you do, you feel a sudden sense that someone or something is watching you. You spare a quick glance over your shoulder. Nothing. You briskly leave the scene, shuffle into your car, and start the engine. I began my journey through Minecraft PSX via the tutorial level. There wasn't anything too out of place here, so I figured I could get my bearings on the controls for a bit, then hop into my own world. Something about the rain and these empty castle walls felt strange. I continued until I found a dock, and set off on a boat until I reached the shores of an island. Exploring the encampment I found there, I encountered my first sign of something unusual in the game. I was suddenly taking damage from nowhere, and as I pleaded with the joystick to turn my head a little faster this way and that, trying to catch a glimpse, I was able to see the shadow of some invisible thing for just long enough to process it was there before it was gone. No longer feeling safe in this world, I quit and create a new save. Attempting to begin my world like any other, I start gathering resources and notice that trees seem rather sparse in this biome. So when I see some leaves just across this hill, I'm pretty relieved until
Someone's already been here. That does not bode well. With the scarce resources I was able to scrounge together, I find a pocket near a cave and immediately begin carving out a shelter. Night will fall soon, and I don't want to be stuck out in the open. Still, there's some time before the sun goes down, and I could use a lot more wood. So I explore a bit, and though I have no luck in finding trees, I do stumble across another unsettling sign that I am not alone here. This time a literal one, reading, "Stop." I think it's time I head back home. I spend the rest of the night mining, and all things considered, nothing too unusual happens. And I think it's here that lies the genius of this mod pack. For most of the game, you're just playing Minecraft like normal. There isn't anything out of the ordinary. You're not really playing a horror game. There's long stretches where you almost forget there's anything wrong. Almost. And then you stumble upon something that snaps you to attention, and you start looking around, suddenly feeling no longer alone. For example, as I continued looking for trees, I came across this pile of items. Where did these come from? Who did these come from? Well, more for me. Things didn't get really scary until a good while later. I was out once again looking for trees and found myself a little bit lost as the sun went down. The panic was beginning to set in as I ran from the just absurd amount of monsters when I saw something in the distance. And before I had the chance to process it further, the sound design on this thing is horrifying, and I was already on the defenses from a night full of close encounters, so even when I came across this structure and wanted to investigate further, I had to cut my losses and keep sprinting toward home. By the time I was away from danger, I was very close to death. I decided to regroup and head back later. Gearing up and grabbing what I hoped would be more than enough food, I made my way back to the coordinates of the unusual structure. Once I arrived, I found little more than some candles, a table, and a flower inside. Still, something felt strange about this place. So, I decided I'd try doing something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I gathered some more wood from nearby trees and began building an outpost, a place meant specifically for keeping a lookout for Herobrine and any other anomalies. It was a weirdly cool moment for me, a fulfillment of a childhood plan I had never been able to complete, actually following through on that Herobrine hunting server and outpost I mentioned from all those years ago. Construction was a little slow going, but during the day I didn't feel too much in danger, except perhaps the odd something appearing in the corner of my eye. Probably nothing. Once night arrived, my incomplete building was still pretty vulnerable, so I tried to spend most of my time underground collecting cobblestone. When I would venture to the top though, I'd keep an eye out. And for a while, there was nothing. Until... there, just at the end of the fog. By the time I made it over there, he had disappeared. I'm not 100% sure what the programming is behind Herobrine here, but I think there must be some pretty ingenious design going on, because I love how Herobrine basically stays at the very edge. If you try to look straight on, the fog of the render distance covers him up, so you can only really see him out of the corner of your screen. In any case, I knew this Herobrine hunting outpost was working. Over the next couple of days, I continued working on this outpost, and aside from the odd sound here and there, things progressed well. My closest encounter came during yet another nightfall. Installing the last of my glass windows, I climbed to the top of the tower and kept a lookout, hoping to catch another glimpse of something like I had a few nights before. Nothing. It was time to head down again when... I'm not sure I can do justice to how this feels to play for yourself. Of course, this is still Minecraft. You're not playing some horrifying monument to terror. It can be a little goofy at times, and there's really only so scared you can get at seeing Herobrine, but there's something really compelling about the atmosphere and paranoia this mod pack can get out of you. It really does feel like going back to being a kid and thinking Herobrine might be in your world. It can be genuinely unsettling, and yes, at times scary. And it does a great job, in my opinion, of balancing the subtlety and horror together, and creates an experience that pulls out all of the bits of horror that are inherent to Minecraft that we've been talking about, and heightening them. And this is only from a short play session. I don't want to spoil too much, and I'd love to hear some of the stories you have if you've ever played this game. That end bit with Herobrine in the window genuinely surprised me, not just in a horror sense, but in how cinematic it felt. The timing and the imagery just felt so perfect you'd think I set it up on purpose. And that's one of my favorite things a game can do, is organically create little moments of cinema in your experience.
Aside from the graphical similarities we discussed earlier, I think there's a reason this mod pack decided to use the PlayStation aesthetic. The PlayStation is in many ways a symbol of the birth of the survival horror game genre. Some of the earliest and most influential entries in the genre, like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Dino Crisis, their look, feel, and design are tied to that console. It's another reason I think the PS1 resurgence has been so heavily horror focused. The PlayStation means something to the world of horror. And with Minecraft PSX, we can see just how well Minecraft could fit into this tradition of survival horror. Still, it's a mod pack made explicitly to crank up the fear. Though we've talked a lot so far about elements of Minecraft which make it creepy or unsettling, it's far from what we need to say that Minecraft is explicitly, definitively a game in the horror genre. So I think it's time we took a look at Minecraft on its own terms and see how its audio, visual, and mechanical design stacks up when analyzing it as a survival horror game in its own right.
Happy Halloween. Patreon.com/SaganHawks if you want to support me. It's only $2 over there. You get a bunch of behind the scenes commentary tracks, exclusive videos and reviews, Q&A, stuff like that. I also have a new album which is out right now for free on Patreon. Anyone, you don't even have to be a member to download it, and it's on streaming on Spotify and stuff. All of that information will be elsewhere. And anyway, yeah, I'm a wizard.
In order to do this properly, I'll need to set a few ground rules. First, I won't be talking about the newer versions of the game. It seems pretty clear that most people agree the game was at its spookiest in the time between in-dev and the beta versions. I also won't be singling out any specific version from this area, and more so discussing the general design philosophy and direction of this period of the game's development. I'll be taking some of these design elements and comparing them against the genre of survival horror generally, and taking some direct examples from some games and features to illustrate these points.
Upon first glance, Minecraft doesn't really appear to be a horror game. Just featuring zombies, skeletons, and ghouls isn't really enough. These are staples of many genres, like action shooters and RPGs, and the influence of RPGs on the game is pretty apparent throughout Minecraft's history. Skeletons wielding bows, looting dungeons, bosses, XP, enchanting. There's no denying that. And of course, the game is first and foremost a survival sandbox with a focus on building mechanics. And despite all we've said about the lo-fi visuals and horror, its simplistic cartoonish style doesn't seem to scream scary. But as Brock Holmquist discusses in his essay Survival Horror, Metaculture, and the Fluidity of Video Game Genres, not only is a game not tied to just one genre, the analysis we do for video game genres has to take into account more than just the narrative and aesthetic conventions. You have to take in all of the game's facets, from gameplay mechanics, tropes, and aesthetics, together to get an understanding of what genre a game might exist in. So let's take a look at some conventions of the survival horror genre and see how Minecraft matches up.
Going back to Holmquist, he posits one of the genre's most defining design features is the relative lack of necessary resources offered in the game. Not only are ammunition and weapons limited in survival horror games, but life recovery items are similarly scarce. On its face, this doesn't really fit for Minecraft.
It is a game entirely dedicated to gathering absurd amounts of resources to build and craft with. And while this is true in regard to the building element of the game, and to a large degree the weapons and defense elements of the game too, I think this tenet shows itself in the health items in early versions. Food was the only way to recover your health, and unless you had a sizable and stable farm, your main source of food items would be pigs, which had a fairly inconsistent drop rate. In addition, food items didn't stack, meaning each one of these health items would take up an entire precious inventory slot. A journey into a cave or out into the night means having to juggle how many individual pieces of food you're bringing, balanced with your other available slots. And this idea of inventory management follows throughout the game, creating stakes.
Minecraft's system of dropping items when you die and deleting them if they're not found in time creates a great sense of calculated risk. The decisions as to whether the player would like to bring their more valuable items when they go explore at risk of losing them, or heading into a cave with their best armor in hopes of more protection with the risk of losing said armor, or whether to leave food behind for later but limiting their ability to use health items in the short term, and what are survival horror games if not games of tension through calculated risk? Even with that said though, I would concede that this point isn't the strongest for Minecraft, especially as the player continues upgrading their equipment and food supply. Early in the game, it can perhaps look closer to the resource and inventory management in Resident Evil, but the player will eventually gear up enough to mostly overcome these challenges. Hand in hand with this tenet of survival horror though, is the genre's tendency to minimize the combat effectiveness of the player character. Enemies are powerful and can easily overwhelm the player.
In early versions, movement and combat options for the player were fairly limited. No sprinting, no blocking or critical hits. Even up to today, the ability to easily get overwhelmed in a cave or out at night is ever present, and enemies like Endermen, skeletons, and baby zombies are understandably often subject to heart attack-inducing encounters, even for very well-equipped players, especially in an environment like a cave, the pitfalls and maze-like quality of which can also limit player movement.
I think this convention of the genre is at least partially true here in Minecraft, and is stronger than the last. However, like the tenet of resource management, this struggle also fades with time as the player continues to build up their resources and equipment. Like, the longer you play, the less of a horror game it becomes. Another of these core elements to survival horror mentioned by HomeQuest is the relative obscurity of progress, unintuitive puzzles, or opaque reasoning and rules of the game. Resident Evil, for example, takes place in a large mansion that the player gradually explores as they unlock new doors and find items granting them access to new areas. Often, these items are laughably arbitrary. Oddly enough, I think this is one of the strongest points in Minecraft's favor. Earlier, I mentioned that Minecraft's community is very diligent with their documentation, and this is true. But it wasn't always the case.
Before the recipe book and 24 wiki communities, actually discovering the rules and ways to progress in Minecraft was really a challenge. You're placed in an open world with the ticking clock of nightfall encroaching, and you basically just have to figure it out. For new players back in the day, you very much had to rely on advice from friends who had played the game or scour the internet for tutorials and let's plays. Now, it wasn't too difficult to figure out the basics, but as you continued to progress, this only became more difficult. Additionally, the game was changing and updating quite a lot during this time. Imagine getting all your information about enemy mobs pre-Enderman, downloading the game, and being met with this horrifying thing.
At this time, the game did little to hold your hand, and this need to search for guides or talk with other players to figure it out does feel very reminiscent of early survival horror games, stuck on opaque puzzles with rules and strategies you didn't quite understand.
It seems fair that any new player would find the experience of Nightfall or a cave to be quite the nerve-wracking experience. And this obscurity to the game's rules doesn't just apply to the progression of the game, but I think to its strongest point as a horror experience. Because the game leaves so much unexplained, the player is never sure exactly what to expect. This is precisely why the cave ambience works so well, especially on new players. It seems to imply something by its very existence. It's the language of horror games and movies alike, telling the listener that something unsettling is nearby or on the way. And the fact that it doesn't actually signify anything other than that you are in or near a cave works in its favor. Without a way to immediately figure out and understand it, you're left with nothing but the mystery of the unknown. We can also see this in something like the gameplay design of creepers. On your first morning after nightfall, you'll see all the hostile mobs from the previous night begin to burn in the sun. This seems to tell you pretty directly that in the daytime, hostile mobs die and you're safe. So when you're peacefully mining some more wood, blissfully unaware, you are perfectly primed for the scare when the creeper that's been camouflaged in the grass explodes right behind you, the hiss only giving you enough time to panic before your screen goes red.
It's such a perfectly crafted scare that I can't help but think it was designed with that in mind. To compare it to one of my favorite horror games, Lost in Vivo, it's the same kind of switcheroo that game executes with the ladder.
The first time you come across it, the enemy very clearly cannot climb the ladder, and doesn't even seem to have an animation for it, which makes it all the more horrifying when the next time it comes up right after you.
Still, this convention of survival horror comes with all the same caveats as before. As the player progresses through the game and they begin to learn the rules of the game, this element of horror and mystery fade away. As the player learns what cave sounds mean, how their progression works, the behavior of all the hostile mobs, the game loses much of this tension. The reason Minecraft PSX was able to so successfully reinvigorate the horror of Minecraft is because it changed those rules, and you once again didn't exactly know what to expect. But it's hard to find that same experience in the base game so many years later, because we've all learned these rules so well by now. A final brief point I want to make here comes down to the atmosphere of the game as it's informed by the gameplay. More specifically, how the graphical or technical limitations can inform horror atmosphere. As HomeQuest points out, the tension-filled door-opening transitions found in Resident Evil were, in actuality, a trick used by the developers to disguise brief loading periods between areas. This, of course, seems relevant to the render distance fog in Minecraft, which, as we've discussed, is largely understood as one of the biggest factors in early Minecraft's uneasy atmosphere, and is often compared to Silent Hill's fog, which again was implemented in part for a similar technical limitation. Similarly, HomeQuest notes that further helping to establish a sense of dread in survival horror games was the complete isolation in which the players often found themselves. There were no companion characters, non-playable or otherwise, for the majority or even the entirety of survival horror games. Keeping it to single player, this is most definitely true of Minecraft, and another often cited reason for Minecraft's lonely and at times unsettling atmosphere.
The world is essentially devoid of any life resembling us. On top of this, the early structures such as mine shafts, dungeons, jungle temples, or villages before villagers were added form an almost post-apocalyptic quality to the world. In addition, I think the game's music helps to accentuate this atmosphere. Jacob Geller discusses this tradition of melancholy and longing in horror music pretty well in his video, Why Do Horror Games Sound So Beautiful? C418's soundtrack for the game often hits with a tinge of longing or sentimentality. There's something more emotionally effective about music that feels wistful or pining in creating a memorable horror atmosphere than just straight dissonant strings or something like that.
In the end though, looking at all I've laid out here, I don't really see Minecraft fitting enough of these criteria strongly enough to feel this argument holds. There seems to be one pattern preventing it from sticking. The longer you play the game, the less of a horror game it becomes. Early on, sure, there can be genuine scares and unsettling atmosphere, but it fades with time. And this seems perfectly in line with all of the history we've discussed so far. Though I think no matter how long you play, these earlier versions undeniably have a more horror tilt to their atmosphere. They were also when many players first began playing and learning the game, when there was less access to guides and information to learn the game. The more inexperienced you were, the more of this horror element shined. I think this might also be why nostalgia seems to be such a big factor in Minecraft horror media we see, because this is when players were most vulnerable to these horror elements, simply because we were less experienced with the game. It's the same thing that happened with Herobrine. The less we know about these things, the scarier they are. Seems a little disappointing, doesn't it? I mean, there's clearly something in Minecraft's atmosphere and mechanics that, at least at first, works really well as a horror game. It's just that it's so clearly a survival sandbox first that the survival horror genre doesn't quite stick. There is one more thing we could try though, a genre built on this slow acquisition of power and competence from the player to overcome the horror in an open world survival setting. And all we have to do is switch the two words: horror survival. I'm not entirely sure how widely recognized this genre is, but I'm sure many of you will know the type of game I'm talking about.
The Forest, Green Hell, Don't Starve, Darkwood, Subnautica, open world survival games which require the player to gather resources, manage food and health, and build tools and shelter to protect themselves and progress in an increasingly hostile environment filled with dangers from the weather to bloodthirsty monsters. Setting them apart from pure survival games, this genre uses the powerlessness and fear that comes from being unequipped and needing to fight and struggle for your survival in an environment that is both much more powerful than you and either uncaring or actively hostile to you, to build a sense of horror and tension through both the atmosphere, visual, and audio design, as well as explicitly using the gameplay mechanics to both make the game more difficult and tense and more terrifying. Is that the longest sentence I've ever written? Maybe. Sometimes this horror element can be more overt, like in The Forest with its cannibals and mutants, or Darkwood with, well, all of Darkwood. Other times, it's a smaller facet of the game. For Subnautica, if you aren't scared of the ocean, there are only a few enemy types or areas of the game you're likely to get really spooked by. But if you are afraid of the ocean, good luck out there.
Of course, all of these games are varied in their gameplay style and to what extent they use horror, but there's a few points that I think help define at least some of these titles, though again are not universally shared. The first is a staple of many survival games, but I think is especially emphasized here: the utter powerlessness you have in the beginning.
When you start, you are given little to no tools, resources, and means of defense. You are often met with threats from many fronts right away, from the weather, lack of food or water, and hostile enemies. And the difficulty of building up from this point is emphasized. It is never easy to survive. However, much of the time, this difficulty plateaus as you overcome challenges and build up safety nets, in the form of more permanent shelter, food storage, items which can automate or in some way make tasks easier, and improved defensive equipment.
Importantly, this is not always the case. There are some of these games in which your life is always in the balance, no matter how much you try to prepare. But this difficult struggle up from nothing at the start of the game is one of the most common themes in the genre, and is the foundation for its horror through helplessness. This helplessness is further emphasized through the nature of the threats you encounter. Like most horror games, the enemies you face are often much more powerful and capable than you are. But in horror survival, you are explicitly up against the forces of nature.
The cold wants to kill you. Fallen trees or poisonous plants want to kill you. Basic necessities like food and water are scarce, and nothing that is here with you in mind. And much of the time, you are far outnumbered by everything from wild predators to monsters and mutants, which know this place far better than you do. This concept is inherent both to the gameplay and the themes of these games, and this human versus nature relationship is yet again where much of the horror comes from.
A final, more specific but perhaps more universal trope is that of nightfall. In most of these games, the threat of night is an ever-present one.
The relative safety of daylight, allowing you to survey the environment clearly, gather resources, and settle a camp, is never a leisurely experience with the anxiety of nightfall looming soon. Instead, the day must be treated as a time of frantic preparation for the horror that nightfall brings. Enemies are typically much more aggressive and abundant in the night, and every convenience you were given in the daylight is stripped away. The impending threat of nightfall is usually when the game's horror is at its peak, as all of the previous themes and horror elements are heightened brutally.
These are all, in my opinion, some of the strongest and most common elements seen in horror survival games, which use their survival mechanics in order to create a horror experience. With these concepts in mind, let's go ahead and see if Minecraft fits into this genre, using the game in this genre I am most familiar with, The Forest, as a comparison. Again, we will be focusing on the pre-release versions of Minecraft for this little exercise.
At the beginning of both games, you are completely alone in the wilderness, stripped of almost any and all tools. In fact, The Forest gives you more to work with than Minecraft, an axe and some food. Though The Forest also doesn't allow you to punch trees with your bare hands, so maybe that's neither here nor there. The threat of nightfall becomes immediately apparent, and a source of light and shelter become the #1 priority. This early in the game, it is nearly a death sentence to be out at night, and as the sun goes down, you become overwhelmed by a host of dangerous humanoid entities. Though you likely haven't gathered enough resources for a permanent shelter, hopefully you've done enough to last out the night. In the case of early versions of Minecraft, before beds were added, this meant literally waiting out the whole night, the sounds of monsters playing all around you. Similarly, in The Forest, if you have no way to sleep, you'll likely hear the rushing footsteps of cannibals or mutants through the grass at some point in the night. In both cases, these are great horror set pieces, making the player understand just how close they are to the danger outside, and emphasizing the fear of the unknown, the fear of whatever it is you can't see but can hear out there, making that noise. As you continue to play, your limited food and need for more permanent shelter keep you on edge, especially as you realize the threats don't completely disappear in the daylight. Now, every sound you hear could be the footsteps of a dangerous enemy, the thickness of the fog or tree line hiding some unseen threat. Eventually, to make further progress, you'll need to head into the caves, and this is an altogether more dangerous and frightening experience. The caves are dark, filled with enemies and pitfalls, and their sound design is just purely unsettling. Not to mention the fear of getting lost, unsure of which paths you've already been down, which way is the way out, just hoping you can avoid the enemies long enough to figure it out. After a long while of gathering resources, building up your base, and upgrading your equipment, much of this early danger will feel less frightening, and you'll be in a much better position to deal with it. There will, of course, be encounters which test your abilities, but that moment-to-moment tension will have dissipated quite a bit. But I don't think this inherently makes either less of a horror game.
The elements of helplessness, isolation from society and outside help, of desperately trying to overcome and survive what these forces of nature throw at you are what make the later part of the game more rewarding. Overcoming the fear makes the confidence you've earned more satisfying. For Minecraft, that's suiting up in diamond armor and tools, with a base and farm you've built up to the point where you can engage in more complex and creative tasks like redstone projects or expansive builds. For the forest, at least in my experience, that horror goes away pretty quickly when you've set up a massive base with so many successful traps and weapons that you basically turn the game into a cannibal go in, bone armor come out tycoon game. Unfortunately, I do not have footage of this because I am making this video on a tight deadline, but rest assured this did happen in a save I had a few years ago. Feels almost like a entirely different kind of horror game at that point where I was the villain. In my view, this genre of horror survival has a much stronger case when it comes to Minecraft. Still, do I think we have a solid argument that this era of Minecraft is definitively a horror game? I think it depends on where the line is between a game having horror elements and being a horror game. Not the most fun answer, but probably the most accurate. It is undeniable that Minecraft has plenty of explicit horror elements and that much of the early game can be seen as actively scary and unsettling. And I think it's pretty clear that there are specific things about the pre-release versions of Minecraft that made the game's atmosphere particularly unsettling, and that this era of the game probably leaned more heavily into these horror elements. Though it's worth noting, even as the focus of horror seems to dissipate, the game does continue to implement horror-ish elements such as the Warden. So if someone were to ask me to throw out a list of horror survival games, it probably wouldn't be in the first few I mention. But if someone were to put Minecraft in there, especially pre-release Minecraft, I wouldn't argue with them. In my view, the game is first and foremost a survival sandbox, and probably below that you could argue it's like a light RPG, but I'm not an RPG expert, so, take that with a grain of salt. But is there a facet of it that is a horror game? Taking into account its history with implementing horror atmosphere and design, and how its progression system implements similar themes of overcoming nature, fear of the unknown, and horror elements in the form of nightfall, monster design, and scares similar to that of games in the horror survival genre, I would say, kinda, yeah. Is that a good, satisfying answer? Does that work? Thank you all for watching. I'll be honest, working on this video, I was coming out of a pretty intense creative rut. I was unable to work for a while on account of busting my hands up in a longboarding crash, and I was just spiraling there for a little bit. So I'm unsure if this is really my best writing or structuring of a video. Still, I wanted to get something done for Halloween, and I had a great time looking over Minecraft's horror elements because it's been a topic of discussion I've been following for a while. And there's so much that I didn't even get to make it into this video. I spent like days exploring abandoned servers and recording footage, and I think I still want to turn that into like a Patreon or second channel video at some point, so be sure to follow me in both of those places if you want to see that. Thank you all again, and I'm really excited for the last couple videos before the new year. Happy Halloween, everyone. See you all next time.
Bro, that's creepy as hell.